My name is Timothy Reichert. You see things other people don't, my mother used to say to me. And those were the words I used as inspiration all my life as I strove to become a film director. But after getting hammered by critics after my first feature and ruining my second with my own ego, I bottomed out in Hollywood 30 years ago, directing episodes for a niche syndicated series no one had any respect for. And within 5 years of feeling on top of the world, I felt like I was at the bottom again, saddled with debt, a drinking habit, and a fondness for a new narcotic the showbiz types called tangerine. In the spring of 1988, my economic circumstances pretty much decided that my mother had to move into a senior care facility instead of living on her own with a nurse. She moved into a place called Waverly Mews, up near Berkeley, that July. It happened with the worst possible timing. The shooting of the last 3 episodes of the series had to be done almost simultaneously because of a technician strike, and that meant I was working 18-hour days when Mom went in, nervous, alone, and uncertain about her future. I apologized again and again to her primary care doctor for not being able to get away. More union problems stretched things out, and I missed her second week at Waverly Mews, too. Her neighbor and longtime friend, who we'd always called Miss Jeannie, laid into me pretty hard over the phone. The worst news was that Mom's signs of dementia had, according to her, seemed to worsen overnight when she moved in, most likely because of the stress. I absolutely could not break away from the damn series for a flight north. Day after day we kept pressing to finish shooting, and every day something delayed us. Miss Jeannie called me on my mother's 14th day in the home, and I got a report about her new symptoms. Mostly it was predictable little things. For example, the home brought in a dog on Fridays, a golden retriever, just for a few hours of companionship in the day room. But my mother kept referring to it as an ostrich instead. I saw the ostrich again today, she told me herself on the phone. And the first time I heard that, it was so sad. More troubling, she had developed a very odd fear related to Miss Jeannie by a very nice elderly couple who lived there, a Scottish couple named Betty and Brian. During meals, my mother would sometimes point to the 1/4-inch crack running down the center of the table where it folded, and she said several times that she was frightened of falling into it. It even haunted her sleep. She always sat as far away from it as she could, and once she had missed breakfast for fear the crack would swallow her up. I was a wreck when I finally broke free to go visit her on July 7th, 1988. I scrapped with the producer about leaving for 3 days and decided to just run for it and let the chips fall. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't focus anymore. The woman who had sacrificed so much to raise me without a father wasn't understanding why I couldn't come see her, and that had to end. I was drunk on the plane, a high augmented by painkillers taken for a back injury I'd sustained, demonstrating a fall to an actor and had told no one about. From the airport I drove an hour and a half to Berkeley. I'd arranged with the home to sleep there on a cot in my mother's room since I'd be getting there after midnight. I remember that night was as hot as I'd ever felt in Northern California, and windy. A half hour out, my hands began to shake. It was just everything coming down on me at once. I allowed myself a hit of tangerine, just one pill dug out from my glove box. By the time I got to Waverly Mews, it would kick in and make me feel lighter, taller somehow, wider somehow, and generally less like me, soothing and surreal. Waverly Mews was tucked away on the edge of a wooded neighborhood, and I found it easily enough. Parked my car in the gravel lot and looked around. It looked just like it did in the photos I'd checked out and sent to my mom before she agreed to move there. It was Miss Jeannie who had done most of the actual legwork. There was a little pond nearby, and access to a walking trail. Trees bordering all sides of the building, just one story shaped like an L. Just 2 other cars in the lot at this late hour. I walked up to the unmarked front entrance and pressed the buzzer. I was sweating and my feet were tingling, the first signs that the tangerine was getting busy. Another dose of shame hit me, knowing I'd be hugging my mother while on that crap. But it kept me on a relatively even keel. The 3rd time I hit the buzzer, and again got no response, I went up to the glass double doors and peered into them closely, thoroughly irritated. The night nurse was aware I was coming, there was no question. I'd talked to her on the phone. A lamp sat on what I guessed was the welcome desk, casting a little light around. I could see a sliver of the dining room past the simple foyer, but everything was shadowy elsewhere, no real sign of life. I gave a few firm raps on the glass and paced outside the entrance. I became quickly convinced that they had forgotten about me. But to me, that didn't excuse having no one at the desk. There had to be a night nurse, probably 2 with a resident population of 25 or so. I backed up a few steps to look around for another way in. I decided to walk along the south sidewalk a ways. There were lots of tall windows on that section of the L shape, but I'd have to trample some flowers. I wasn't in the mood to be delicate. The first window I approached gave me a view into a big room that seemed set up for physical therapy. I saw mats and bars and a treadmill. But they'd squeezed a couple of game tables in there too, checkerboards painted on their surface. And in the corner closest to me was a patch of differently colored carpet with a few children's toys spread out, and a huge dollhouse. A play area, I guess, for the very occasional child who came to visit with their mom and dad. It all sat in semi-darkness, maybe 2 panels of overhead fluorescence still lit. That huge dollhouse was the first thing that was wrong. It wasn't a normal one, it was a general replica of Waverly Mews itself, about 6 feet long. They even had the colors right. Everything had been condensed and there was no glass where all the windows would be. Those gaps were open so kids could poke their fingers through. But what child would find that fun? Especially since when I stepped all the way up to the glass to get a better look, crushing the flowers beneath my shoes, I could see that one of the residence wings was detailed to the point where there were beds in the rooms. The tiny little beds of the elderly of Waverly Mews. And in each bed I saw, when I squinted hard enough, a small doll. All identical. Little plastic dolls, bought in bulk. Each one was face down on its bed, 10 of them in all. But no, I saw not quite identical. There were men and women. They had no clothes on their cheap, factory-made bodies. They'd all been entirely stripped. I rapped on the glass in vain. I seemed to remember myself crying, mentally exhausted. Please, I thought. I want to see my mom. Why are you doing this to me? The next window down was totally dark, so I went one more. My shoes now streaked with dirt and new mulch. I looked in on an utterly empty room with an uncarpeted white tile floor and a very big drain in the center. It must have been 5 feet across. It was like a shower room of sorts, but there were no nozzles in the ceiling or pipes or anything. Just that enormous drain. The wrought iron kind you see on a city street. As I watched, water emerged from it, rising gently from beneath the floor. The water began to spread out on the tile, covering a wider and wider area. Soon there was a pool of water an inch deep, covering an area of about 8 feet on all sides, and I thought some pipe had broken, but then it all seemed to retract, be drawn back toward the drain as if there were a slope there, which there certainly was not. The water rolled from all sides back into the drain, and slowly disappeared beneath it, leaving no visible trace of itself, no stain. The room was just as it had been when I'd first peered through the dark window. Returning to the front entrance, I dropped my decorum and pounded hard and loud on the glass with my open palm, pressing the buzzer again and again. There was no payphone in sight. I was probably miles away from the nearest one. The communities around me were quiet and woodsy, no place nearby to shop or congregate. I felt like the only person alive. Where were the people those 2 cars belonged to? A rational me would have tried to drive and find a payphone regardless, but I was not quite that person because of the stress, because of the pills. I was going to get inside one way or the other. I yelled out to anyone who might be in there, not caring if I woke up the sleeping. My answer was nothing more than the wind blowing my hair into my face and making the trees rustle and sway. No real moon that night. Everything was quite dark. Everyone in there is dead, I thought suddenly, with no reasoning behind it. And then these nonsensical words came to me. They will go into the other world on foot. I found myself repeating them twice in my mind, trying to sort out what I was trying to tell myself through the haze of inebriation. But the words disappeared quickly, to be recalled only years later. I went looking for a side entrance, and I found one at the far west end of the place, having no particular hope it would be unlocked. It was unmarked, unlit, one solid door. Tilting my head up, I saw the reason for the unusual darkness. The 2 spots where bulbs should have been had nothing fastened there, just empty sockets. I would find out much later just why that was, and it's one of the images that most often comes to me in my nightmares now. Those bare sockets where bulbs had actually been very recently. If I had looked into the bushes around me hard enough, I would have seen them in there, intentionally cast away. But in that moment I merely pulled on the handle, and the door opened. I emitted a strange, short bark of dismay and relief. I entered Waverly Mews, wiping my eyes. Life was worth living again, even if only for the next few minutes, when I could see my mother in her lonely little room. One time when we were 6, we'd gone to the zoo, only to find it had closed early for some reason. But she got us in. I'll never forget. She did not quit until she got us in there, seeing so many animals for the first time in my life. Eve Louisa Reichert was her name. I was in a long, featureless hallway lit only by small emergency lights embedded in the ceiling. Turning left at the end of it, the hall got much wider. I had entered the main community area, lights out all around. I walked past the welcome desk and 2 pitchers of cold citrus water, which looked fresh. I poured myself some into a Dixie cup. My mouth was so dry. I looked into the dining room, 8 round tables, 4 chairs at each. A fish tank, glowing blue, set up beside a small fridge. I called out, "Hello?" Turning to the right and walking past a stretch of wall featuring some canvases, which the residents had apparently judged for a local middle school, I found myself virtually in total darkness in another long hallway. The rooms of the residents on either side, each one numbered tastefully, with a different photo of a flower below it, a human touch. A decent place, as much as I could afford. I didn't know if my mother was here or in the other wing. Why was that hallway dark, though? Why was the whole place so dark? I took a few steps forward. There was an open door to my left and a last name, in script, below a photo of a rose. Alvarez was the name. I vaguely recalled that name from one of Miss Jeannie's stories. Mrs. Alvarez was not inside her room for some reason, though the covers were pulled back, the sheets rumpled. Beside the bed on a rollable tray was a box of Kleenex and a magazine, Southern Living. The TV over her bed was on, but there was no sound. What was showing was very odd. Through an unstable signal and a fair amount of static, words were simply scrolling against a black background. I recognized those words soon enough. It was that famous poem written by some anonymous lost soul seeing God's footsteps in the sand beside him as he walked on the beach. That poem you see on wall hangings and posters. The words were printed in giant type, in a very severe font, all angry capital letters, as if they were more a brute commandment than a folksy message of hope. When the poem ended, the scroll repeated, and here it was again, rolling silently up the screen, too fast to even read unless you were quick. And again, an endless loop through the static. That is not real, I thought to myself. Don't trust it. Trust only what you can touch. I left that room and kept moving. None of the other doors were open and none of the last names were mine. I turned the corner and I was in a short connecting hallway twice as wide, with big picture windows, and a pleasant cutout where a large TV was mounted to the wall. 6 easy chairs were arranged so the residents could sit together and watch. Someone was sitting in one of them, but a blanket had been draped over them, all the way up to the top of their head. I whispered, "Hello," as I moved closer. I touched the person's shoulder through the blanket, causing it to drop just an inch, revealing their forehead. I pulled the blanket away slowly. It was not a resident of Waverly Mews. It was a bald man of about 40, dressed in nurse's clothing. His eyes were open, but he saw nothing. There was a messy splotch of blood on the center of his chest, where his garment was severely torn. So much blood. I screamed for the first time since I was a child, really screamed into the silence. I raised my shaking hands in front of me as if they had been burned by touching the blanket. I imagined I must have looked like a character in a bad horror movie, urged by a director to make motions no one would really make in real life, but that is just what I did. They're all dead. They're all dead. They're all dead, I thought, as I moved swiftly past the TV area and turned the corner. Another residence hall. I saw something else all the way at the end. A moving shadow on the light blue carpet, emerging into the intersection, coming around the corner. The shadow grew, but withdrew again. And then I heard an odd sound. A rustling. A shadow stretched across the wall now, and right after, I saw a thin, small head. A head attached to a long, undulating neck. The thing it belonged to stepped into the intersection. It was about 5 feet high. A great bird on tall, spindly legs. Through the dark it looked at me, lowering its head, tilting it in curiosity. It took 2 clumsy, awkward steps forward. It beat its wings once, creating an echo. An ostrich. The thing was visibly old, filthy, as if it had crawled from some tar pit. There was no real light, but still I saw its eyes, specked with the glitter of pupils. Its mouth opened slowly and hung open, as if it were hungry, beckoning to me to bring it something. Bring myself. It made no sound, standing there with room 118 on one side of it, room 121 on the other side. Doors closed, its inhabitants unaware. I felt hypnotized, compelled to meet its vacuous gaze. It took another step forward on those ugly legs. I could hear it breathing from so far away, raspy and sick. It was challenging me to come, I think. I broke my hypnosis with another scream. I turned and began to run. I ran past the dead man's staring eyes back toward the common area. I think I was hollering my head off, nonsensical words, hyperventilating. The dining room had changed. There were no tables anymore, sitting there in the dark. Though the walls were the same, the sink area, and the fish tank still there in the background, the calendar of events scrawled on a whiteboard beside the refrigerator. The carpeted floor had been split by a great fissure, a crack 30 feet long, but only a few feet wide, as if there had been an earthquake. I sank to my knees, helpless, nothing but a spectator to whatever was going to happen to me. I heard moaning sounds, several human beings moaning. Then from that crack, something emerged. A human arm, groping for something to clutch onto. Another one appeared a few feet away. The head and torso of a human being popped up. An elderly woman. She was covered in that black, tar-like substance. Her mouth open and closed as if she were gasping air for the first time after living beneath the earth. Someone came out from the crack beside her, actually striking her with his left arm as he emerged as well. A skinny man in a robe, also caked in black, his bald head turning this way and that to take in his new surroundings. The moaning grew as more people came out of the crack, confused by where they were and why they were cursed to live. 9, 10, 12 of them, dressed in the night clothes they'd gone to bed in. The residents of Waverly Mews, grasping and clutching to pull their broken bodies out of the crack in the floor. One old man had made it all the way out and began to crawl forward, face down. Crawl towards me. I got to my feet and ran back toward the side entrance I'd come from. I pulled something in my back, aggravating my injury from the fall, but I kept moving, limping, having regained a glimmer of logical thought when the pain struck. A door appeared at the end of the corridor. Not the one I'd come in through, but I'd already lost my bearings. As I ran toward it, I was sure the door would disappear somehow, or be inexplicably locked. But I pushed down on the bar and it released me into the night. I was at the rear of the building, the side facing toward the woods. Right in front of me was a small flat field, beyond which lay the entrance to the walking trail that led into those woods. A sign advised residents not to enter it alone, and not after dusk. It felt safer to run towards it, so that is what I did. I almost missed entirely a shape coming right toward me. It was so dark. The sound of a clear, sane human voice stopped me and brought me one more step back to reality. An old man speaking in a faint Scottish accent. "Please help," he said to me. It turned out to be Brian, of the couple, Betty and Brian, who were friendly with Miss Jeannie and kept her up to date on my mother's condition. Brian wore a robe and slippers. What was left of his thin strands of hair blew in front of his eyes. I asked him what had happened, and he said that there were others in the woods, and he said names I didn't recognize. A man had taken them in there, a man who had come and woken Betty and Brian and said there was a problem with the building, and they all had to move far away from it until it was safe to return, and he'd led them up the path. But Brian had quickly fainted. He'd been weak, and when he woke up, the others were gone. Now he was scared for Betty. I'm scared, he said again and again. Before I could even urge him to, Brian had begun to lower himself to the grass, and I grabbed his arm and helped him down. I told him it was going to be okay, that he would be safe staying right there while I went up the path. I was weak because of my pill, he said feebly. every one of his 80-some years weighing his brain and his body down. I went into the woods. The night went from dark to black, and I firmly believe it was only the single dose of tangerine that allowed me to see the edges of the cement path before me. They seemed highlighted by a silver tint that sometimes showed around objects when I had taken the drug. It was almost like being in a darkened theater with running lights embedded in the floor to guide my way. I saw almost no detail in the trees around me, and the sky above was almost entirely blotted out. But the path was presented to me with merciful and seemingly impossible clarity. The path twisted and turned. There was a large, featureless heap directly in my way. I immediately thought it was a body, but no. As I approached, a deer got to its feet in a panic and sprung away, off the path and into the woods. I was sweating profusely despite a breeze that would have been lovely in any other context. A nice night for a walk in the dark. I stumbled once, just once. That imaginary film director in the back of my brain may be urging me to trip to enhance the artificial drama. I scraped my hands on the cement, but I stayed upright, plunging ever deeper, starting to limp badly. They all came into view very suddenly around a bend, looking like inert zombies from that same film. 7 residents of Waverly Mews stood on the path, still processing the scene around them, their faces indistinct. Some turned toward me as I approached, and most of them raised arms to point me in the direction of the one who had brought them there, and then suddenly abandoned them. One man sat against a tree with his head down, and barely had the energy to lift it to look. Their voices called out to me, urging me either to stop and help or find him. Find him, that's the way he went. I kept going, leaving them behind, sensing I was close. And I was. It was no more than 20 seconds before the path ended. But it was a mere 10 before I felt something else pull in my back, knocking the wind and the muscle out of me. The path dumped me out onto a second open field. The stranger was there in the distance, maybe 40 yards away. He had stopped and seemed to be waiting for me. The sky seemed a dark gold around him, city lights miles away tinging the sky, and my chosen opiate distorting it in a sinister but strangely beautiful way. He was holding my mother in his arms. I didn't need to be any closer to know in my gut it was her. I screamed out to her. Maybe I screamed, "Mom." And just maybe I screamed, "Mommy," spiraling back 4 decades in my childlike desperation. The stranger let her go then, dropping his arms. Yet my mother hung there in suspended animation. He raised his arms again and spread them like a magician, showing off. Look what I can do. My mother's hair hung down, but she floated 3 feet above the ground, asleep and unaware. I limped forward. The stranger turned and led me chase toward the thinner woods beyond, but I didn't care about him now. As I got closer to my mother, the pain in my back intensified until I was gasping for air. And when I reached her and flung my arms out to protect her from a sudden descent to the grass, she vanished, winking out of existence without a sound, my right hand an inch from hers. The gold in the sky dissolved abruptly and transformed into a deep purplish blue. The stranger was gone, though I think to this day that I saw his last few steps before he went into the shadows at the bottom of a long, sloping hill. That way lay the sleeping town of Enderley, but not for miles. A lot of ground to cover in the dark, and somehow they never found him. He was terribly thin, they said, and had a beard, but beyond that it had been difficult to see his face. Even as he had told them out there on the path that there was a magic trick he wanted to show them to pass the time before it was safe to return to the house. But then he had commanded them to be still and listen, sensing someone coming. And he had snarled at them that none of them were going with him to meet Father Hall tonight. Those were his words. 3 of them swore. A bizarre utterance of an unfamiliar name whose significance was never discovered. One resident, an 82-year-old former mathematician named Lance Dulles, said he'd glimpsed the hunting knife the man carried and had used to kill the 2 on-duty nurses at Waverly Mews that night. One murdered as he watched television. The other shoved inside the laundry room and stabbed 11 times. She had left bloodstains that I had somehow missed in the very hallway I had first entered, just beyond the door that the stranger had darkened by removing the bulbs, to move in greater secrecy. He'd likely done that the night before, the police told me. A theory supported by some photos taken of the place by a visiting grandchild 36 hours before he went in. 3 residents had refused to go with the man into the woods that night, but he had acted quickly and convinced some others. My mother had woken to see him standing above her bed. But without a word, he left her again, having perhaps judged her too weak to walk the trail. My mother, Eve Louisa Reichert, passed away 14 months later. She was living with me then. I was taking care of her full time, working at home as a medical coder, so I wouldn't miss a day with her. On the day I moved her out of Waverly Mews, a week before it was closed down, I peered through the tall windows at those rooms I had seen on my nighttime visit. There was neither a drain nor a dollhouse. My mother's dementia slowly worsened, but she always knew who I was. One night she did tap on my bedroom door, and when I asked her what was wrong, she told me she had seen something in the backyard. Through the window. I saw the ostrich, she said. I told her it would never come back, not while I was with her. That made her feel better, and she went back to bed. But I did go to the kitchen and look out. You see things other people don't, she used to say to me. I waited for that to happen. But the January wind blew across nothing but dying grass. My days of alcohol and drugs and even vivid flights of imagination were over. Reality continued to frighten me for a long, long time. But I am old now. Good night.